I'm here to run a panel with a very distinguished group of panellists. So I guess my first duty is to call them up to the stage. So the panellists we've got, well, Nareen's standing here. So Nareen, you may as well come and take your seat. Yes, probably going from the other way because the podium is slightly in the way this side. We also have Professor Cathy Eager, Anne Summers, Professor Anne Summers, Professor Nareen Young. I tell you what, this is a very heavy professory panel. Sorry, Cathy McGowan, you're not a professor, but please come to the stage anyway. And Jenny Briscoe-Hough, I'm guessing. Good, thank goodness I got that right. Also not a professor, but we've got 3 professors. I'm not a professor, so I balance it out. 3 are, 3 aren't. And what we're really focusing on this morning is why older women's experiences and perspectives matter in policy design. And it's hard to think of a better group of people to give us that perspective. So before we begin actually discussing things, can I get you to give our panellists a round of applause? Cathy McGowan, Cathy Eager, Nareen Young, Anne Summers and Jenny Briscoe-Hough. Thank you all for coming. I think I might stand up. Oh, no, I've got a handheld mic. It's just easier holding my notes up here. What do you think? Should I stay standing? Yeah, okay. I'll stay standing. We're going to begin with... actually, I want to begin first with Professor Cathy Eager, Director of the Australian Health Services Research Institute. Cathy, you were recently very involved in the Aged Care Royal Commission. And this actually really shocked me when I heard this, that there are twice as many women as men receiving aged care. And, well, you know, some of us can't help wondering, is that why aged care is in such a deplorable state?
Thank you very much for inviting me, and can I say that aged care is the ultimate place where ageism and sexism walk hand in hand. And I've been involved in aged care for the last couple of years, having had a very strong background in healthcare, and I was so shocked to discover the normalisation of unkind and unsafe care. And it wasn't that it was unkind and it was unsafe, that was seen as the best we could do and that was all that was required. And I do think we really need to think about that. I think most people were completely shocked by the Royal Commission, the ghastly experiences. I was an advisor behind the scenes at the Royal Commission, and can I tell you, when I read the case studies, when I saw the photos, it was the worst I have ever seen as someone who's worked in the health system all my life. But I do want to make a point that aged care is the place where the health system and the housing system walk hand in hand as well. And we've spent 2 decades now oscillating between saying aged care is all about clinical care for old people to aged care is all around a social model of care where we can deprofessionalise the care because social care is cheap and easy. And that's the decade we're coming out of. So I do think we need to be clear about that. And I guess the last comment I want to make is about the nature of policy. One of the responses to the Royal Commission was to say, well, look, that's really simple. We'll now deliver aged care at home. We need to do more and more of that. And that's seen as a win for government. It's cheaper and it's a win for consumers because after all, people don't want to go to a nursing home anyway. But I do want to make a point about when you're at home 24/7, who are the people who are caring for you? And the second thing I want to say is that 40% of women over 75 who live in a private accommodation live alone, compared to only 20% of men. And that's because we outlive men and men go to aged care, residential aged care, at a different rate to women. So when we think that community aged care is the solution, we need to understand that we've got a community aged care system that is predicated on secure home ownership, and we have two factors at play. One is homelessness among older women is the fastest growing segment of homelessness, and the second is an increasing number of older women being forced into an insecure rental market where they cannot modify their homes to make them safe. So we really need to think our whole policy response and not be sucked into simplistic paradigms that government wants us to adopt because it's cheaper.
Just before we move away from you, Cathy, I'm also interested in the work that's been done, a considerable amount of work that I'm sure you're aware of, by Dr. Catherine Barrett and with the Older Women's Network about sexual assaults in aged care and the need to take the absolutely terrifying statistics about the number of assaults that occur seriously and why we still seem to refuse to.
Yeah, okay, so a couple of more statistics. About 40 women in nursing homes in residential aged care in Australia are sexually assaulted every month. And that's a really shocking statistic. The majority of those sexual assaults are by male residents, not by staff and not by visitors. The other thing, and there's two groups among those males. Some of them are men with dementia, and some of them are men who've been sexually assaulting women their whole lives, and they don't change when they go to aged care. The other figure I want to bring in is that when the government was piloting what's called the Serious Incident Response System, they had aged care workers collect data, and in the group of serious sexual assaults, this is rape, genital touching, sexual assault, 56% of those women residents were assessed by staff as not being affected by the sexual assault. And that's because those women were seen as having dementia and therefore they didn't notice. So we've got these very deep systemic issues in aged care that the normalisation of sexual assault has occurred over time. And what do we do? Many women would actually now prefer residential aged care for women only.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. It's very sobering. Every time I hear those statistics about sexual assault in aged care, it sends a cold shiver down my spine. In fact, Anne Summers, as I was at the launch of your wonderful research into domestic violence and its consequences in Australia today, which you entitled The Choice, Violence or Poverty, which is a very telling title. What surprised you when you did this research? What really gave you pause?
Is this working? Do I need to do anything?
Nareen, do you want to pass her yours, see if that one works?
Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Jane, for mentioning my report. And as you said, it's called The Choice. And if anyone wants to read it, you can download it free. Just go to violenceorpoverty.com and there it is. I did this work because it seemed to me that single women and single mothers, were being left out of the conversation about violence in Australia. And we all know single mothers get a very bad rap from all of us, including other women. And it seems to me that they're being left out of the conversation about violence, domestic violence, was something that ought to be investigated. And so when I went to the Australian Bureau of Statistics and asked them for data on single mothers, they told me they didn't have it. And that in itself was terrible. But they did tell me that it's not that they didn't have it. They told me it wasn't that it wasn't obtainable, it just wasn't published. But if I wanted to ask them to do a customised study, they could dig deep into their data and do it and give it to me, which is what they did. And as a result of that, we have never before published information about the extent of physical and sexual violence against all groups of women in Australia. And the really shocking finding was that 60% of women who are now single mothers have experienced violence from a previous partner. And the reason they're single mothers is because they left that violent relationship. Now, the other side, and there was a very large number of women in that situation, 185,700. Against that, there was a further 275,000 women who are still currently, as we speak, living in violent relationships, which they, about a third of them would like to leave, but don't, because they have no money or nowhere to go. So the link between poverty and violence is something that we, I don't think, fully understood, and I've tried to make that link and to explain it, to document it. And I don't think we fully understood, I mean, we knew it, but I don't think we were saying it out loud, that women have to make this terrible choice. Do they cop the abuse and not disrupt their kids schooling and their kids' friends, and risk having to end up living in a car with the kids, as so many women do, at least temporarily, when they leave? I think it's something like 12% of the women who leave spend at least some of the time sleeping rough, including in their cars or in vacant buildings or what have you. So it's a truly shocking situation. I also welcome the chance to talk about ageing if I get a chance later.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. You will definitely get a chance, because I think, in fact, the next question I'm going to say is what you're describing, and perhaps what we're starting to uncover, is a whole of life situation. We have a habit in this society of dividing people up by demographics, as if young people are always young, middle-aged people are always middle-aged, and old people were just born old. I know that I thought that when I was young. I have to confess, I remember having that thought. Shocked to find out not true. But what you're talking about is women who, because they live in violent and abusive relationships, end up predisposed to poverty and homelessness. Also, I know that they very much fear, if they go into poverty, another reason keeping them into in abusive relationships, if they go into poverty, that they may lose their children to the very man who has been abusing them, are very much the likely people who will end up without proper care, proper resources when they age. Because it's not like they're suddenly going to come into money, one assumes. And yes.
Well, look, what I would like to do is to answer that indirectly, if I may, because in thinking about this panel and the question that we've been asked to address, and that is, how do we influence the discussions, how do we insert ourselves into the conversations and the decision-making affecting us now that we are older, speaking for myself. And it just seemed to me that we need to think about this politically and strategically. And so I did a few little figures last night, and I just want to share them with you, because I think we need to understand the context in which we are undertaking this work, because it is new work.
Yeah.
Not just new for us, it's new for society. Now, my father was born in 1913, when Australian men had a life expectancy of 55. My mother was born in 1923, when Australian women had a life expectancy of 68. I was born in 1945 and have a life expectancy of 70. That story in itself is pretty interesting. A woman born the same year as my father would have a life expectancy of 58, a bit older. A woman born today in Australia has a life expectancy of about 83. So in the 110 years since when my father was born, our life expectancy of Australian women has increased by 25 years. That is huge. So we have an older population that we never had before. So we've never had to deal with these political issues affecting older people, because there weren't any, or there weren't as many, and there weren't these huge populations that we are all now part of. But that's not the full story. These are life expectancy figures, as Stephanie made clear. They're averages. People who are wealthy and who are lucky live a lot longer than people who are living in different circumstances. The single mothers we're talking about who grew up in poverty and whose kids grow up in poverty are likely to be at the lower end of that expectancy, not the higher end. But that's not the full story, because when my father was born, he had a life expectancy of 55. He actually lived to be 75. He died in 1988, age 75, and we thought that was really old then. My mother, whose life expectancy was 68, she died in 2005 at 82. She was very fit. She played tennis the day before she died. She lived in her own home. She drove a car. She maintained herself. She didn't need care, fortunately. But how much longer that would have gone on, who knows? Now, I have passed my life expectancy date of 70. I'm now 77. And looking towards 80 with, some fair amount of apprehension. I'm going to an 80th birthday on Saturday. So many of my friends are now turning 80. I used to think that was the age at which I would leave this world, having someone who believes very much in taking control of the end as much as possible. I now think that maybe that's a bit premature.
Yeah. I think the rest of us do too, Anne. Please don't go.
But I think what I'm trying to say is that there are now millions of us who are, old. We have to say we're old, not just older, but old. And my life expectancy actually is if I'm going by my parents, who lived 20 years longer than the official expectancy, my life expectancy is 90. So I've got another 13 years to go, at least, if all
Well, let's
30.
make sure she gets lots of work so she can continue doing all this good new research.
She
that
just
we
got a
need to
3-year
know.
contract at the age of 77, so that's pretty
Excellent.
pretty good. But what I'm saying is we need to understand that this is a whole new population that governments have no idea how to handle. We've seen that through the failures of the aged care system. When we think about old people, we think about sickness, illness and disease. We think about poverty. We think about all the problems. We don't think about any of the great things about it, as celebrated by the theatre group. It's not a matter of not being dead. It's a matter of having... Most of us can expect to live 25 years after we formally retire from our jobs. These are years of extraordinary opportunity if our health holds up, and we might have crooked knees and all the rest of it, but we could be doing amazing things. And one of the things I think as the conversations we need to enter into and the policy decisions we need to be influencing are not just about aged care and what happens when things go bad and things go wrong, but how we live good lives while we can. And there are things that I think we should be looking at. Why can't I serve on a jury after age 65? Why can't I give blood? Why does travel insurance cost 5 times as much? And if you're over 80, very hard to get anyway. So there are all these things that we don't talk about nearly as much as I think we should. And these are the things that we should be at the table talking about, trying to influence, so that we can improve our lives as much as possible. I'll shut up.
Joe Biden couldn't serve on a jury and nor could Donald Trump. That's interesting. Thank you, Anne. One last quick question. Is there any longitudinal study being done anywhere in the world which tracks young women experiencing violence into their old age to see what the impact of violence is over time? Is any of that work being done?
Well, in 3 years' time, I hope I will be starting one.
Excellent. Very good. Thank you.
On women's health, yes.
Yeah. Oh, good. And does that look at violence? Thank you. Thank you. Lady at the back there, if anyone wants to know where those reports are, she has the info.
I also want to say that racism is a social determinant of ill health.
Absolutely.
I made that point earlier in my talk, but we need to know that it's now a measured social determinant of ill health.
Yeah. And sort of on that point, I'm now moving to Professor Nareen Young, and now based in this very university at the business school, and you've advocated for diversity for a long time. especially for the inclusion of First Nations women. And as Stephanie is pointing out, First Nations women cop, really the lion's share of a lot of this stuff, don't they? Racism, misogyny, family violence, education gaps, life expectancy gaps. The figure I've got here is that Indigenous women are living 8 years less than non-Indigenous women. Is anything changing, Nareen? Is anything improving, or are things even getting worse?
Thanks, Jane. So first of all, I just wanted to acknowledge country, and we're here on the land of the Gadigal. I'd like to acknowledge elders past and present and ancestors who walk with us. I'm an Eora descendant from this land. I also want to acknowledge, I believe Anne Field is here. There you are. Who I found out was going to be here on Facebook this morning, who was my teacher in Year 7, and was an amazing, lovely, kind teacher in an environment where I got horribly bullied by the principal and other teachers because I had undiagnosed ADHD and I was really mouthy. And Anne was one of the teachers who was very, very kind to me. So I just want to acknowledge that. And there was probably a bit of underlying racism as well. So just in terms of the question and Anne's response, it's really interesting to hear that because obviously our people have our life expectancy is much less. It's interesting to hear you say as a group and dawning on you that you don't have control over policy and practice that profoundly affects your day-to-day life. That is the life experience of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in this place on a daily, minutely basis. In terms of change, I think it's patently obvious that that's why we need our own autonomous self-determinationist way of developing and inputting policy, and that's what the Statement from the Heart seeks. So we want you to not just support it, but a whole room of activist white women, non-Aboriginal, and you don't look to me incredibly diverse, Soz, but you have capacity and time to be involved in the campaign, so we'd like you to support our campaign if possible. But, you've all obviously stuffed a few envelopes in your time and knocked on a few doors, so you know what that's like. So I think what we're dealing with here is the deep and profound racism that exists in this place with regard to how Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are viewed and our capacity to have control over policy, our own lives. Housing has always been such a deep issue. I found something out really, really interesting yesterday. We've always known that my great-grandmother was Aboriginal from Redfern, so a Sydney woman. We've suspected that my great-grandfather was too. They got married in Mayfield. We know that. We don't have much documentation about their early lives, and lived there for a couple of years. And I found out yesterday, I'm constantly amazed at the resilience and innovation and capacity of and the point I'm getting to is about how our communities look after themselves around things like housing and employment. So I found out yesterday from a Newcastle brother that in Mayfield there were Aboriginal safe houses that mob created for ourselves, and we lived and could pass as white and therefore work, which is what people in my family did. And that because it was a multicultural community and working class, and of course working class people, and I'm white and working class on one side, have always been much more tolerant and accepting of us, despite what some of you might think. Absolutely working class communities have supported us. And so Mayfield was somewhere that we lived. So we have always been incredibly good at looking after ourselves and looking after each other. And it's not a lot of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander older people, and I'm classified one now, and I'm 58. I'm going really well, despite having had preeclampsia when I had my first child at a level 240/140 in the delivery, which was due to indigeneity and inherited it from my grandmother and blah, blah. We don't tend to be in aged care a lot, and we want our own aged care places because we know that in every other aspect of life, I'm all right because I'm white passing. I don't get followed in the street or stared at or followed in shops or all of those things that happen to our people. I've got family members who look black, and so they have a very different life to me. We know that racism, and my mother experiences it, in the aged care system is profound. Of course it's going to be, because in every other aspect of life it's going to be. So as you activate around self-determination, around how your end-of-life years are going to look, please support us in developing a new understanding of what it's like to have policy made for you and have no input into it, ignored, thought to be stupid, all those things, all those stereotypes. It might give you a new understanding. And Jane, I hope with the implementation of policy in the new policy environment, and particularly around the statement from the heart, I thought I'd turn that off. Maybe things can get better.
Thank you, Cathy. Cathy. Nareen. It's because I'm going to Cathy next. Thank you, Nareen. That was heartfelt and important. And I was hearing yesterday about the Voices of the Heart. Can I ask how many people have actually read the statement, the heart? Oh, good. It's the most... Fantastic. Because it's the most beautiful piece of writing.
Yeah.
That's what really, really impressed me about it. And I thought most Australian official writing is so written by old bloody white men, sorry guys, but honestly, and this is so beautiful. It's a really important historical document and moment. So thank you very much. Talking about policy, talking about politics, Cathy McGowan, come on down.
Back at you, Jane, back at you.
What can you tell us about how the diversity of our population, I think I already know the answer to this, is or is not reflected in making policies and in the drafting of legislation in Australia? Do you think things have improved a bit? We know the representation of women has leapt up after the last election in certainly the lower house. I think it's at 44%. But it's still not something to write home about. Sorry, I'm quite keen on 100% myself. But anyway, Cathy, where are we at?
So I really welcome the chance to be here today because I've got 3 things I'd like to share with you. Each one of us has a vote, and it's in using the democracy system that we've got in a strategic fashion that created change. So that's really what I've come to say. And a group of people, 12 of us in Victoria, decided what one thing, if we did really well, could make a difference to our lives. No more busy work, no more turning up at meetings, just one thing. And we ended up calling it acupuncture politics. And acupuncture politics works on the assumption that you find the acupuncture point, one of them, and you put pressure on it, and that pressure creates the change in the system that you want. So that's what we decided to do. So we formed a small group. What one thing could we do that would make a difference was use the competition in the democratic system we've got to make our seat safe, from safe to marginal, and in making it marginal, have our voices heard. Now, there's nothing new in that. It's not outrageous. It's not a feminist plot. It was just straightforward pragmatic, we were over anything else that wasn't going to work. So when I talk about that, forming the group, what one thing, and then doing it. And we were astonished how many people responded to it when we, a small group of us, provided the leadership. So the number one thing I'm saying is a bit of leadership goes a long way, but the leadership to actually do the work. So it was a lot of work to engage the community to get those 35,000 first preference votes that we needed. It was totally possible. 4 months, we did it. So that's the first thing, is I really want to say to us here, government is not on our side, per se. Like, that's not news to all of us. But being there from competitive seats is how the system is designed to work. So that was the thing. So that was all right, got elected, got to Parliament, that was fine, things happened. But clearly when I got there and looked around, it wasn't enough just me being there, and particularly with my passion for rural and regional Australia, like the National Party wasn't doing a particularly good job at representing women, let me say. So that realisation was, sitting there on that crossbench, was if things are going to get better, we need more of us there, obviously. So that was the second part I want to say. One is the political system exists for us, and it's not hard, truly, to move it. So the next challenge was to get more independence up. And all I have to say is I finished in 2019. Helen Haynes, as we know and love, picked it up from northeast Victoria. And in the last election, if I'd got 30,000 votes in 2013, Helen got 40,000 and won, like, because people obviously love what she's doing. Like, it's not a fight. But the thing was getting what I would call then more independents running. And in the 2022, there were 23 independents running. Community-based independents doing the change. Now, 6 plus Fowler plus the Greens give us the crossbench we've currently got. Now, what I want to say is that wasn't hard. Like, it was work. But it was doing one thing, focusing and bringing our resources to it. So now we've got that fantastic crossbench we've got. Now, we all know there's another election in 25. So we're looking clearly for those of you here. And I'm not saying the answer is to be the candidate.
Thank you for pointing at me when you said that, Cathy.
Yeah, the answer... No, well, you did a fantastic job, but the answer is to be on the team. And if you're not on the team doing the acupuncture work, if you're still describing the problem, you're part of it. So the final thing to say, and then I'll wrap it up. So in summary, use the system that we've got. Everyone's got to vote. To be on someone else's team and help, bring your strategy to it. And the third thing to help you do this is this organisation we've created called a Community Independence Project. It's on the line, and it's providing network and resources to people to do their own work. So it doesn't do stuff, it's not top down, but it just says if you're interested in being on someone else's team and want to get a group together, here's some steps, but much more importantly, we'll link you up to other people who have done it. So I just want to summarise and finish on this point. Thank you to the wisdom of Anne, I'm looking at you, and the feminist movement that actually explained to me that the personal is political and the action is possible, but only doing one thing, not 10, and doing it well. And if all of us so that's why I wanted to say the message is if you're not already on a team to support a community independent or a radical feminist of some form of vagueness, then get one going. And you only need, as the wonderful Margaret Mead said, a small group of people to be strategic, to be focused, to getting better representation. And regardless of your seat, if it's a safe seat, you're in trouble. Your voice will never be heard. Making your seat competitive in terms of political competition is incredibly important. So that's what we learned. And then I'm just going to finish off with the Helen Haynes example. So Helen Haynes and that crossbench have not only brought that integrity commission in, but it's an integrity commission of outstanding, I'm going to say calibre, but I want a better word. Like, it's going to work. And it's only going to work because she did the work. She came up with the principles. She got everybody else organised. It became an election issue. Oh, and thank God for that. The current government said, well, we're not going to do it. That did help. But it was Helen did the work. So she knew what the acupuncture point was, and she did the work. And I think we could do that with housing. And at the next election, if we could actually do the work, not just describe the problem, what is the one thing, if we as a nation did really intelligently around housing, and then we ran it as a campaign like the climate 200 people have done with climate, it would be resolved. But we don't have the intellectual capacity yet to actually come up with, well, what is the one thing that we as a community, and not giving the power to government, that we as a community want to do about housing, and including housing for older people. So that's it. I'm going to stop on that. That's sort of the sermon from Cathy.
Thank you, Cathy. Can I just give a tiny shout out for the Senate, the neglected house, because we've only got one reliable progressive vote other than on the crossbenchers in the Senate. That's because everybody gets... Yeah, of course. Just let me finish this. That's because everybody rightly gets very concerned about who their local member is. But if you've got a shit-ass local member and you can't move them, you can change who's in the Senate. So look carefully at the Senate. Most people come to the election knowing who they're going to vote for in the House of Reps, no idea about who they're going to vote for in the Senate. And state, of course, coming up for New South Wales. And we also have an upper house in the state elections. Think about both. Yeah.
Sorry, is it so long? Cathy, can I just ask a question? I actually worry a bit about your definition of radical feminist because, for example, as a labourist, as someone who cares very much about wages and working conditions in a feminist context, Zali Steggall, for example, has voted with the last government on workplace relations every time and supported small business and the small business, the policy pieces that small business put up. So I have formed a group called, with a whole lot of other women, called the Low Paid Women's Alliance, and part of the point of that is to lobby the new Teals about the needs of low-paid women in particular. And Allegra Spender, for example, one of her first pronouncements was around flexibility for business and small business in particular, which, of course, in Australia means lower wages and bigger hours and no proper contracts and casualised workforces. So I just think we need to be really careful around what we mean when we talk about feminism in those contexts, because to me it means all women, inclusion, intersectionality, black feminism in the Australian context is the basis for any kind of feminism and how we look at it in Australia, but it really means labourism and wages.
Thank you, Nareen. I am aware we have one panellist who as yet hasn't spoken. So, Jenny Briscoe-Hough, who has helped to revolutionise the way we deal with death, which is a fairly fantastic line to have in your bio. What was it? What did it take for you as an older woman to bring about such a change? And for those of us who aren't as aware of what that change is, what is it?
I don't know if that's on. Is that on? Yeah. I feel so humbled to be sitting in this group of people, actually. When I read the group, I was like...
none of them have changed the way we think about death,
I know.
Jenny. No.
Anyway,
Not one of them.
Anyway, look, I probably... the reason I did that was because I got cranky about it, really, and it's a completely solvable problem. So I suppose the most important thing for me around it is that if we reconnect with our capacity to look after our own dead, we reconnect we grow up actually as a culture, and we begin to also reconnect with life. So I think we were sort of had been left out of that process, and so we can pretend death doesn't exist. We can pretend we can't deal with it. We can remain like children in the face of that. But the more we are connected with it, actually, the more it gives back to us. So I think the reason how I did it was that I had no idea how to do it, and so I was like, oh, I don't know how hard this can be. It was pretty hard, but it was also a really great opportunity to think about, if you don't know anything, how would you do it? How should it be done? And I think that was what was very exciting about what you were saying about here we all are, and we don't, and let's invent it, So that for me was very exciting. So really, we just adopted this process where we handed the death back to the community, and we opened a community-owned and operated funeral home where we work with complete choice and transparency, and we have some employed staff and we have volunteers. And the whole process of that was really surprising for me. I didn't think there would be volunteers, but there were volunteers, So I've been learning the whole way along. So now we've opened a second, we haven't opened, we've written a social franchise model, and, really it was I wanted to have a very flat, sort of much more sort of feminine models where there was not this heroic leadership, where we were all working as community. And so now we have a network of people around the country. We've opened 2 tender funerals. We've got 23 communities. Yeah, it's good, isn't it? I changed my sort of password to 25 tenders, which was a really bad idea. So it's anyway, so what I found is that people want to be involved, that people know what they're doing. We want people to come. We offer them the choice of being part of, do nothing or do everything. So people can come into the mortuary, they can look after their own, they can come and put their person in the coffin, they can reconnect with that process. And, brilliantly, people want to do it, and they are doing it every day. And so in traditional funeral homes, 2% of people come into the mortuary. In a tender funeral home, 45 to 50% come into the mortuary. So it's very helpful, and very helpful for young people. I'll just say one other thing about, about growing older and the job of being older. And one of the final jobs of being older, of being a grandparent, is to teach your grandchildren about death. And it's a great job to do. It's a great job, because if you can teach your grandchildren about death, 1, they get to grow up and they get to understand that life is limited. 2, they're going to know what to do when their parents die. So it's a big job, but it's so worth doing.
Thank you, Jenny. Now we have only 10 minutes left, but that's a good amount of time to have some questions for the panel from you here in the audience. So please don't hang back. Put your hand up, ask your question. Lady down the front with the red dress. Oh, there's a roving mic, which means poor Christine is going to get her steps. No, down here, Christine. No worries.
I heard everyone this morning, and yes, I've been enthused. I was deeply, deeply impressed, Stephanie, because you included racism as one of the social determinants which I experience almost daily, weekly, monthly, weekly. And it may be hard for most of the people in this room to understand, because I see a sea of white faces around me. Maybe there are 2 or 3 people of color. And then when I heard Nareen, I said, for God's sake, in the end, somebody has acknowledged diversity and racism. Thank you, Nareen. And as an older woman of color, and I'm 75, thank you very much, And as I face my own mortality and my own feelings of existential angst that come over me every day, I say, what is modern Australian society and politics doing for people of colour? They are just absorbed, they're submerged in the entire white women's problem. And if you think you're invisible because you're white, I'm going to use some bad language, but maybe I better not.
Oh, please.
F me dead.
Fuck you
People
dead, darling.
of colour
Yes.
are not just invisible, they're standing outside the door.
Yeah.
So if you don't understand our problems, you don't understand the obstacles, you don't understand anything about us, but we say, oh, we're going to give you policies. You poor little bastards, stay outside the door because we colonial advisors will tell you everything. That's all I want to bring. Thank you very much.
Anyone want to respond before we move to another question?
Can I just quickly, I think I know who you are. Hi, so good to see you, sister, and I'm so glad you're here because, got to say, you're all lovely, but walked in and went, whoa. Like, I don't know what your recruitment policy is, but ladies, you need to be bringing people in a bit. And, you know, there's well-established, FECA has women's networks and all of the culturally diverse groups have. I was thinking about what you were saying, Anne, about life expectancy and your mob, right? Because I've got a theory that the ultimate act of colonialist bad behaviour, which was the Great Hunger, which is what they call it in Ireland now, not the famine, because it was a deliberate policy by the coloniser, led to lots and lots of health issues for your entire mob, who then came here, and growth issues and a whole lot of things. And I was thinking about that in the context of what you were saying, and the nature of colonisation and the profound effect on health of a whole lot of us who live here, and how immigrants from Ireland, I think, seems to me, it's not my lived experience, but in all of your epidemiology is that incredible racism and discrimination that carried on here. And, you know, if you want to have a good look at talking about that beautiful address by Michael D. Higgin in Australia about how the colonised became the coloniser. But anyway, I just think in terms of what you're saying is, in all of this, it is so absolutely embedded in how we think and respond. And I'm not saying that anti-colonisation and decolonisation is the answer for everyone, but I think given the migration patterns, the development of this colony and the way we all think, taking a decolonisation approach wouldn't be a bad thing to think about.
Thank you. There's another question at the back and another one over there. Do you mind if we take a few? Are we going into lunch at 12?
Hi, my question's for Cathy. My name's Sonia, and I'm sorry I can't stand up. I've got a bad leg. I'm hoping to organise a group. We've got Wakehurst Independent for the state elections just coming up in March, so please don't forget your own communities at that time. But one thing I found when I was working on the federal election before for Sophie was that engaging older women was harder. You know, a lot of people had never been asked the questions about politics or thought about them in a new way. How would you recommend engaging some of the older women groups that, you know, sometimes are harder to get to? We can't go into aged care, for example. We can't sometimes get into organisations to talk to people. How would you encourage us to hear their voices better than we currently are, and try and engage that section of the community even, more than we already are?
Look, it's such a should question. I don't know the answer, quite frankly, but I do know about engaging with people, so I can't speak to that specific. So as a politician, as a candidate standing for election, the way I engaged people was with my two ears, and the question is, do you think things could be better? And wherever I found them, asked that question, and where I got the smiles, I said, come on in. So there's nothing new about that. You know, we didn't try and change anyone's mind. We didn't try and proselyte that you need to be there. Would you like to be part of a movement that can make things better? And there's a lot of fun involved. Yeah. So we had no trouble attracting, first off, 500. And again, Helen Haynes had 2,000 people. Monique Ryan had 2,000 people door knocking. So the secret is to make it inclusive, obviously, to be welcoming, and the other thing is to invite people in. And it wasn't about politics. One of the things I think about the traditional parties is you sign up to politics, whereas the community independent is about representation and community engagement, and there's no answer to that. It's about, well, there's no right and wrong here. There's a complexity of issues, and I'll be your representative, and I don't actually have to represent one position. I can actually represent or enable representation. So I think you just go and ask, and you start small, and you build the word of mouth that the process is values-based, genuinely inclusive, and the people are people of integrity. And the word moves when you start becoming that change. The word moves really quickly. We didn't have to find people. But I just have to say in the end, it started small and it grew. And it grew because word of mouth worked. It didn't grow because the leaders said, you've got to come or we're doing anything different. It grew because we went everywhere to people of colour, people of difference, and said, do you want to be part of it? You're welcome. And what one thing would you like to do that would make a difference? Because we're not actually going to be the answer. Our job is to represent. And my job was to represent. So when I got into power was to go into groups in my community and saying, okay, here's the pathway. What one thing do you want to do? And I will open the doors that I've got for you. So doing it in a small way and it working, people then went, oh my God, I'm going to do that. And then people will get organised and do the work. So I don't know the answer to your question, but I do know the process, which is tap on the shoulder and invite in, and then create warm and inviting spaces where people can enjoy themselves and have fun.
Thank you,
And theatre, we haven't picked it up, but can I say, theatre, drama. So we had choirs, we had street theatre, we had every activity that we could possibly do that would create engagement. But can I just say on behalf of us, that theatre this morning was fantastic and those songs brilliant and did such a good job with the message. So maybe I'd say get a choir into your old people's home.
Have to learn to sing. Thank you.
So there were some other questions. A lady with the white, few more hands
I
going
have a
up.
question or a statement, if I might. Thank you so much for the panel. I'm one of the amateurs in the room, clearly, and I'm really grateful to be in a room full of women who are that I've never experienced before. I would have to say that. How old am I? 52, and I felt proud that my daughter is older than one of the ladies here at the thing. She's 28 today. She earns $250,000 a year. I was a single mother. I couldn't have done it without my family support. My mother died on time at 62 from breast cancer. You know, we all have a story, but language is really important, and I'm really grateful that it was mentioned by the first speaker, voice, that comes from the Uluru Statement of the Heart. My mother was a refugee from Latvia. Our people in Latvia go back all the way to the beginning of time, and we're taken by nation after nation after nation for our greatness. And I want to put to the room and to the panel, what do you think about changing the language of that radical feminism to indigenised feminism? Language matters. Indigenised feminism. Dr. Alicia Barrett at the University of Western Sydney has written a paper and is working with a gentleman at Macquarie University, I believe, in the healthcare of Indigenous healthcare and an Indigenous way of healthcare. And he suggests as we indigenise the academy, having recently graduated with my honours, I was traumatised by going to university as an older woman, single mother who wanted to get my education back. It took me 8 years and it was devastating. I've never been so traumatised by a patriarchal thing. I've never had such growth, such generosity of spirit as well from women. So, you know, I didn't fight for the Aboriginal flag. I wasn't raised Aboriginal because my grandmother, 1916, also defied the odds. At 13 years of age, was granted a bursary and couldn't take it. And I believe through my research, because if she would have been, all her brothers and sisters would have been taken and they were terrified. So she failed to get an education. And she got an education through my father, who became a federal court judge and does not recognise himself as Aboriginal. So I stand here today and I'm proud of her and her lineage. And I'm so safe house. I just wonder if Dungog had a safe house, because they moved pretty fast out of Wellington when the killings came again. So thank you so much for this panel, for this day, for Facebook ads that sent it to me. That's where you can get some diversity inclusion next year. May this room be a stadium full of diverse women next year, for women like you, that none of you end up in your cars, and certainly no one in my daughter's generation ends up in a car. Nobody, woman, man, child.
Thank you.
Thank you, sister. I'm sorry to hear your family story, and losing culture, language, identity is so common among our people. And then in the culture wars, people have the temerity to criticise us for re-identifying after what we lost. It's an extraordinary thing that I think goes to the nature of this place. Again, I would like to see us re-Indigenised, Indigenised feminism. I think everyone needs to read Professor Aileen Morton Robinson, the mother of black feminism, and Dr. Jackie Huggins' books. I think that the Uluru Statement and the truth-telling probably needs, and I'm going to be really nice about it, a bit of a reckoning of women and Australian women and how we all view our place and role in this place, and a bit of a reconsideration about putting black feminism at the centre of how we view this place. And that's not to discount or denigrate Australian feminism. I am a mainstream Australian feminist and I absolutely support it, but I think we need to think about Indigenous feminism and black feminism as playing a bit of a centre.
Thank you, Nareen. Now, there was some hands up. Yes, lady in pink.
Hi, thanks very much. While we're talking about diversity and inclusion, my name's Megan Etheridge, and I would like to raise for your consideration a new group. Well, it's not a new group, but it's now being recognised, I hope, more and more, and I hope after I've spoken that you will be able to recognise it too, and that is women with a criminal record. Women with a criminal record, their numbers are growing, and they're growing. And I don't know if you realise that women are put in prison these days at a huge rate, 50% more over the last 7 years, in fact, and most of them are there for less than 12 months. Once they go to prison, they lose their family, they lose their house, they lose their job, and they lose their place in the community. And they find it almost impossible to get over the discrimination that exists. They may have gone to prison because, you know, we punish and we continue to punish vulnerability and disadvantage in our system. And we continue to do it after our justice system says, we've punished you, but we continue to do it. We all continue to do it. And I want to ask the panel if you've ever considered that when you're talking about diversity and inclusion, you might like to identify that these women actually are suffering discrimination across a whole range of areas in our community. And while we stay quiet about it, we're to blame. Thanks.
Thank you. Would anyone on the panel like to respond to that?
Hi, Melissa. Very good to hear you remind us, or perhaps inform some of us for the first time, about the not just the terrible situation of women in Australia being in prison, but the fact that it's growing so fast, the fact that the majority of these women are Indigenous, The fact that there's almost 100% correlation between imprisonment and having experienced domestic violence. There is a deep pit of disadvantage that is magnified. And as you say, these women are punished for their vulnerability, and then the punishment cascades because it's very, very hard to recover your reputation, to recover your record, your children, your community links, because of the discrimination and stigma attached to having been in prison, even if it's for a very, very minor offence, and sometimes not even that. And we also know the number of very disturbing incidents over the past year or so of women in custody but dying, not necessarily in prison, but sometimes just in police custody, most of them, again, Aboriginal. And I think that we do have to find ways to bring these women and women who are potentially in that situation into our work, and to find out how we can how we can address them. I don't have any solutions, but I think you're right to remind us that we can't pretend it's not happening.
Thank you. The question? Yes? Yep.
I did have a question, and it's to Anne again, because the concepts I took away from your report, and it might be very close to what we've just said.
Could you hold the mic just a bit closer?
That poverty doesn't cause domestic violence. Domestic violence causes poverty. And the second conclusion I drew is that government policy is what is keeping these women and children in that cycle of poverty after domestic violence. Then I overlay another statistics, which is single-aged pensioner would get about $940 something a fortnight, and yet someone on job seeker would only get $600. So there's a $300 gap straight away that we can relate to women and children probably, and older women on job seeker, maybe domestic violence survivors. Now, in the local area I come from, I find a lot of the older women are doing voluntary jobs. Jobs that were once paid jobs are now becoming voluntary with organisations that run a charity organisation under that banner, but basically it's legalising voluntary work for women who should have got paid for these jobs. They're asked to do courses at their own cost, work, 5 o'clock in the morning to 9 o'clock at night. I'm standing here going, this is not right. Is your research, or is there something, or could you make a comment on that, please?
Yes. There are a number of things you've raised, and I thank you very much for reading the report, reading it so carefully. I think the two or three things I'd like to respond to. One is I talked before about the fact that 60% of single mothers with children under the age of 18 have experienced violence, and that's why they're single mothers. And as I mentioned in my survey, there was 185,700 of them. There's another group, a much bigger group, 800,000 Australian women who have experienced violence from a previous partner and who are currently living alone. In other words, they're not partnered. That's a huge group. We know nothing about them. So they're obviously within the women you're talking about, these single older women who are often in very precarious employment situations, not necessarily eligible for welfare. We need to know a lot more about this group, these 800,000 women, and they're not part of my next project, but I will be encouraging other researchers to look at them, because the knowledge is there to be found, and we need to know who these women are, what happened to them. They tend to be older than the single mothers. I think a lot of them probably were single mothers. Their kids have grown up. Whether they're still in touch with their kids, we just don't know. But this is a huge population who have been damaged, whose experiences have not necessarily been recognised. Their trauma hasn't been dealt with, and we need to find ways to acknowledge that. On the second thing about the payments, you're quite right that the difference between a woman getting job seeker is about $660 a fortnight, something like that, and the single age pensioner gets almost $1,000 a week. So there is that $300 a week difference. The recommendations of my report, as you would know, were that the women, single parents, but mostly mothers, of course, who are forced onto job seeker once their youngest child turns 8, at a time when the kids start to get even more expensive. So why would you put them on a payment, take them off parenting payment? At the moment, it's $208.80 a week, a fortnight difference between the parenting payment and job seeker. And that difference increases every 6 months because the indexation is different for job seeker and for the parenting payment. So if you see in my report, there's a graph that shows the difference between the two payments over the past 20 years, and the gap just grows and grows and grows. So the government policy is not only creating poverty, it's embedding its increase. And it's quite correct to say that it's government policy to keep these women in poverty. And since the report came out on the 7th of July, so it's only a couple of months ago, I and many others, and I have to pay tribute to Sam Mostyn, who's just heading up the government's new Women's Economic Equality Task Force. She's also the president of Chief Executive Women, a group that's not normally known for getting involved with disadvantaged women. However, they have endorsed the findings of my report, and they are CEW is lobbying in Canberra for single mothers to be taken off job seeker and put back onto the parenting payment.
At last.
I haven't given up that this might happen in the October budget. It's probably unlikely. It's probably too soon. But I've personally met with the Treasurer. I've personally met with the Minister for Finance. I've had a phone meeting with the Minister for Social Security, who's in charge of the payments. And there are a lot of people who are working on this. And I would encourage any of you who have any opportunity to say to your local member or to anybody who's in a position to influence these decisions that there is no more needy group in our society of these single mothers with children who are living in such poverty. They include Indigenous women, they include refugee women, they include migrant women. So when I say women...
They probably include women with a criminal record as well.
They probably do. I mean, so these are the among the most, if not the most needy people in our society. And it is a Labor government created this policy, and this Labor government has got to undo it. Yeah. And I can't say that forcefully enough.
Cathy, you wanted to say?
Yeah, I really want to pick up that group and what happens to them when they age. There are 900,000 women in Australia over 75, and 365,000 of those women live alone. And we don't have models of care for older people. About 1 million people, by the way, out of the 1.65 million people over 75, about 1 million people are getting some level of aged care. But I don't think at all that we have an aged care system that is fit for purpose for women who have experienced disadvantage all their lives, and then they go into old age having had that experience. Our whole aged care system, including the consumer organisations that advocate for it, has been driven by articulate middle-class people who use words like consumer-directed care and how we can have a competitive marketplace, because that's what's going to work for them rather than the most vulnerable people we really need to be looking after.
One of the things we never hear mentioned about aged care in particular is trauma-informed care, because the women you're talking about are often living with PTSD. They have not had trauma dealt with.
Yeah. The other thing I want to say is something about dementia, because it's something we haven't been talking about today. There is a very, very large number of people with dementia. There's also, in my view, a large number of women who are classified as having dementia when what they actually have is anxiety, stress and anger. And the easiest way to normalise that is to say, if somebody put me in resi care, I'd be really angry and I'd be really difficult. And then they say, oh, Cathy has dementia. And when I talk to staff who work in residential care, they see the people that are not distressed for them that they see are women who go up to the nurses' station on the hour every hour, really worried about their future. Yeah. So I think we have to be very careful. Dementia has become a socially acceptable way to put somebody into care. I tried to look after Dad, but he got dementia and that made it okay. So I do think we need to be much better support services for women and men with dementia, but we also need to be really carefully checking those statistics, and that it hasn't become a convenient, it's the equivalent of ADHD for naughty kids.
or locking women up in asylums when
I'm
they...
not talking about the genuine kids with it. I'm talking about the number of people who are classifying kids who have got problems because that medicalisation of a problem makes it go away.
But also it does remind me forcibly of the shutting up of the mouthy, difficult wife in an asylum.
Yep.
And it seems we may be repeating the same pattern without even realising it. Very, very quickly, Jenny, because you haven't said much. We are out of time.
I just flagged the idea of end-of-life carers leave as being a policy thing that we could look at, and that would include that we have maternity leave, but we don't have end-of-life carers leave. So that that would be across the board, male and female, and we need to be saying why are we missing out on caring? Not that caring's a burden, but why are we missing out on the learning of caring as a whole society? That's all I want.
Thank you very much. Can we thank our wonderful panel, Cathy McGowan, Jenny, oh my God, I've forgotten your last name, Briscoe-Hough, Cathy Eager, Anne Summers and Nareen Young. Brilliant insights, lots of passion, and I noticed a reference to fury quite a lot, which I really approve of. All right, enjoy your lunch. Get fueled up for more fury.